me push the record button here. Yeah.
Okay, welcome back, class, to our next 2 sessions this week. The session today will be a lecture that I'll provide on Iran, offering a fair amount of background information about Iran, which should be useful to you in the crisis simulation that we're about to conduct. Okay, so let me begin and ask Mansuk to post the first slide. Okay, there's the beautiful flag of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Next. So Iran, there you see it on the right of the circle, was formerly Persia. It has a population today in the neighborhood of 81 million people, which makes it second to Egypt in the Middle East, second largest Middle East country. In land area, it's second largest to Saudi Arabia. In Iran, 53% of the people, a little more than half, speak Persian or Farsi. 18% speak Azerbaijani, and only about 2% speak Arabic. So there's a very tiny Arabic population in Iran. It's very strategically located in Eurasia and Western Asia, and has long been involved with the Straits of Hormuz, which is very critical for trade throughout the world. You see how much larger it is than Iraq to the west. Okay, next. Iran, of course, notably is the largest Shia nation in the world. 90% of its population is Shia, which means that they adhere to the religious view that only blood relatives of Muhammad can succeed as the leader of the Shia community. Iraq is now the second largest in the Shia world. 63% of the 40 million Iraqis are Shia. In the 20th century, the Pahlavi dynasty was established and lasted from the mid-1920s till 1979. The country was originally called the Imperial State of Persia in the Western world, but then Reza Shah, who was the father of the Shah of Iran, changed the name from Persia to Iran in 1935. Okay. A critical moment came in 1953 when Iran freely elected Prime Minister Mossadegh as its governmental leader, but he was overthrown in a joint British-American Special Forces operation. Mossadegh was a socialist with ties to the Soviet Union. He nationalized the British oil holdings in Iran, and this triggered the first US CIA action in peacetime during the Cold War. It was viewed as part of a Cold War operation, but it tremendously alienated the Iranian population against Britain and the United States. Next. Mossadegh, by the way, lived a fairly long life after he was overthrown. He wasn't executed or anything. He was just removed from office. This is basically an anti-Soviet move by US and Britain. Okay. Reza's son, the Shah, Mohammad Pahlavi, became the new head of state. His power was greatly strengthened after Mossadegh was overthrown. Shah Pahlavi was pro-Western. He sought to modernize the economy and even provided assistance, both intelligence and oil, clandestinely to Israel. He was anti-Soviet, and he aided the United States in its Cold War policies. He was against the Soviet Union. He established a Savak, a secret police force, which is very, uh, it was the Savak was established with the assistance of the CIA, and it fed Shah Pahlavi's authoritarian tendencies. He was pro-Western, but he wasn't democratic. He didn't adhere to democratic principles. He was an authoritarian monarch. And notably, which really helped to his demise, he was not religious in a country that's very deeply religious. In fact, it's later said, maybe it's on the next slide, that Shah Pahlavi never visited Mecca or Medina one time, the birthplace and death site of Muhammad, one time in 25 years of rule, but he visited St. Moritz, the fabulous French ski resort, every year. So this was a very flagrant, irreligious act by the Shah. Next. In 1977, when Carter was in office for the first year, he actually had a greeting for the Shah in the White House, where he publicly hailed the Shah. Carter hailed the Shah as an island of stability in a sea of turmoil. This was slightly inaccurate, because almost within the months of Carter's statement, anti-Shah demonstrations began in Iran, which led to the killing of demonstrators. This was followed by a mourning period, followed by renewed demonstrations, followed by more killings. And this was a cycle of opposition that led to the growth of the opposition to the Shah. That was in 77 and 78. Next. The key opposition figure at this time was not even in the country. He was Ayatollah Khomeini, a very prominent Shia cleric, a notable religious figure who had been exiled by the Shah and went to Paris in 1964. And Khomeini began to send audio tapes from Paris and smuggle them into Iran, exhorting the population to overthrow the Shah. He was a very inspirational speaker and had tremendous appeal, especially to the rural population. That's a photograph when the Ayatollah returned to Tehran from Paris, with all his supporters cheering him on. Okay. There's a photo on the left of the Shah, on the left, and President Carter. That was Carter's welcoming of the Shah in 1977. But later, after this escalation of the opposition to the Shah, one of the key features which was hidden was the fact that the Shah was suffering from a terminal cancer condition. And he became very indecisive in dealing with Khomeini, shifting between appeasing the protesters and declaring martial law. He didn't know how to deal with widespread opposition to his government. This placed Carter in a very difficult position. Carter viewed the Shah as a key ally in containment of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And Carter was torn between what to do about the Shah, and chose ultimately not to intervene and not to use force, not to use American force, or to assist with Iranian forces in helping the Shah. It wasn't clear as things built up over 1978 what was going to be the result of this opposition, whether the Shah could put it down or not. Okay. One interesting feature of the uncertainty of what was going on was Foreign Affairs magazine, very prominent journal that publishes many articles, even by heads of government, heads of state, and other prominent officials and scholars. They wanted to do a major piece, a think piece on the future of Iran that would be published in the December 1978 edition of Foreign Affairs. At that time, it was published every 3 months, 4 times a year. They looked around, and there were very few American experts on Iran. One was James Bill, Bill, who's professor at Texas, and later wound up at William and Mary. He spoke Farsi. He was married to an Iranian. He'd been there many times. And Bill drafted an article for the end of 1978 in which he could foresee 5 options for the future of Iran. One was that the Shah would basically rebuff the opposition and stay in power, which Bill thought was now low probability. A second was that the Shah would transfer his family power to the other members of the family, so retaining the so-called peacock throne. His wife in particular and his son thought possible successors to the Shah. This Bill thought was more likely. The third option was the Social Democrats, many of the French-trained political figures who were in the parliament in Iran, that they might take power. A fourth would be that there would be a military coup against the Shah, and the Iranian military would seize power. And the fifth would be that the Tudeh party, which is the Communist Party of Iran, with perhaps Soviet help, would take power. So again, 5 options. The Shah retains power, power transferred to other members of the family, Social Democrats, the military coup, or the communists. What was noticeably absent from this list, of course, was that there would be a separate Islamic theocracy that would take power, which is in fact what happened. It shows you how remote or uninformed in a way the American intelligentsia was about the future of Iran. Next. In January 1979, right after the Bill article was published, actually the Shah abdicated. He was getting more ill from his cancerous condition, and he fled to Egypt, and then later shifted around. He went to Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, and New York for medical treatment. And then he went to Panama, and then back to Egypt, and he died there at the age of 60. Remember, since the Shah's ascendancy to the power of the government, as well as the head of state, was based upon the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime, the Shah was always viewed as illegitimate by large segments of the population, that he was installed by the West. Okay. Next. And then 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned, declared himself the supreme leader, and established the Islamic state of Iran. Khomeini was not a Democrat. Khomeini was a totalitarian theocrat, a revered religious leader, and an important political figure. And he immediately called the United States the Great Satan and pledged to the death of Israel. there was this amazing moment of Khomeini stepping down the Air France plane with zillions of people waiting for his arrival from Paris. It was an amazing moment. Using audio tapes and inspirational language, Khomeini overthrew this extraordinarily powerful Shah of Iran, contrary to Bill and all the other predictions from the West. Okay. A couple of things happened that were very important right away. One was that Iraq decided to attack Iran. Iraq was still governed by Saddam Hussein. Remember, Saddam Hussein is a Sunni figure in a Shia country. And he was actually hoping, he was a secular man, just hoping to grab the control of the Iranian oil to go with the Iraqi oil, which would have put him in the catbird seat in terms of oil production in the world. Reagan was president now. Carter had been an unpopular president. He was defeated in 1980. Reagan won the election handily in 1980 and was immediately confronted by what to do about the Iraq-Iran war. And he decided to side with Iraq because he said in a way that Saddam Hussein, Iraq, was just a typical military dictator, whereas Iran really presented an ideological threat to the United States because Iran really was vehemently anti-Western and anti-American. The war was a stalemate. Iraq actually used biological and chemical weapons against Iran, but Iraq was not able to seize Iranian territories, and Iran itself had tried but was not able to overthrow Hussein. So this was a very bloody war, and it lasted for 8 years, with the Americans more on the sideline, providing some support to Iraq. Okay. In 1989, just a year after the end of the Iraq-Iran war, Khomeini died. And he was replaced by a new Ayatollah, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, similar sounding name, but very different men. Khamenei was a political figure, not a religious leader, and a kind of cautious figure, anti-Western, anti-American, but without the charisma of Ayatollah Khomeini. And Ali Khamenei remains the head of state today, since 1989, though he's getting older now. In the meantime, the Iranians established free elections for their governmental figures. And since 1913, they've elected President Hassan Rouhani, a moderate, as the president. Rouhani replaced Ahmadinejad. Remember, Ahmadinejad was the young man who helped storm the American embassy in 1979 and was involved in the seizing of the 52 American diplomats who held hostage for 444 days. Ahmadinejad, unlike Rouhani, is deeply anti-American. That's photographs of Khomeini on top and Khamenei on the bottom. Okay. The incident I described earlier, the seizing of the American embassy by Iranians, including Ahmadinejad as a young student, Took place in November 79. There they are climbing the fences. It looks a little bit like the January 6th seizure of the Capitol by the insurrectionists. Young Iranian activists broke into the U.S. Embassy in downtown Tehran. Ahmadinejad, a member of the group. Widespread media coverage in the West. Remember, an embassy is sovereign territory of the foreign country, so they're actually invading the United States by doing that. And of course, Carter was very concerned that the 52 hostages would be executed, which would have been an absolute catastrophe. Instead, they were just held for 444 days, so over a year in captivity, and many efforts by Carter to negotiate a release of the hostages failed. Okay. A key U.S.-Iranian incident occurred in April 1980. That was before the presidential election. Carter was urged by Brzezinski, who was his national security advisor, to authorize a rescue mission to get the hostages out of Iran. And Brzezinski was opposed by Cyrus Vance, Carter's Secretary of State, who did not want to use any kind of force to get the hostages out. And this broke out into a major dispute between Brzezinski and Vance. And ultimately, Carter sided with Brzezinski against Vance, and Vance resigned. It's one of the rare instances of a major cabinet figure resigning over a policy dispute. Vance resigned over Carter's decision to use clandestine force to rescue the hostages. The operation involved special forces, 8 helicopters, and an aircraft. They were going to land in the desert and then proceed by surface transportation up to Tehran to obtain the release of the hostages. But there were problems. There was a sandstorm. 2 of the helicopters crashed, and Carter, under duress, canceled the operation midway. So the group never got to Tehran to try to rescue the hostages. This is a huge defeat for Carter. It was, nothing was accomplished. It was malfeasance of the operation. The hostages remained under Iranian control, and Carter was viewed as a weak president. Historians have subsequently raised questions: what would have happened if Carter was successful in that? This was an unanswerable question. Some believe if Carter had somehow pulled off the rescue mission, he would have been able to defeat Reagan, and that would have changed the whole operation, the whole future of US policy. But we'll never know. It didn't happen. The rescue operation was a failure. Carter was humiliated in April, and the election in November, he was substantially defeated by Governor Reagan, governor of California, to be the new American president. Next. Here is a really very dreadful, damaging photograph of President Carter on the cover of Time magazine. Debacle in the desert. An attempt to rescue the American hostages in Iran was aborted Friday when 8 crew members of a U.S. aircraft were killed. President Carter accepts full responsibility. This worst case scenario, it couldn't have gone worse for President Carter. The sandstorm, the helicopter, the aircraft destroyed, the raid abandoned, the hurting of Carter politically. It's horrible. damage. By the way, the economy was not doing well either. There was a lot of inflation and the economy was very sluggish. So the double whammy of the failure in Iran and the sluggish economy doomed President Carter's reelection chances. Now, was there another item there about the linkage to the Reagan campaign? Let's see, what's the next slide, Mensuk? Oh, okay. Yes, so here, no, move on to the next slide. This is a little bit of a personal story. In the early 70s, I was a graduate student at Columbia getting my PhD, and Columbia had PhD orals that were pretty stiff that every PhD candidate had to pass. And they encouraged students to form small study groups. And I was part of a 4-person study group, 3 other people and myself, to study for the PhD exams. One of them was a man named Gary Sick, S-I-C-K. It's a funny name, but very serious guy. Gary Sick was a US naval officer and an intelligence expert on the Middle East, fluent in Arabic. And Sick graduated slightly before I did, and then he got a job back in the Pentagon. And then after that, as a naval officer, joined the NSC staff, National Security Council staff, under Carter. And he was a key figure on Iranian policy. In fact, it's ironic because Sick reported to a senior man, Bill Quandt, Quandt, who's a very well-known Middle East expert. And Quandt said to Gary Sick, I'm the senior guy. I'm going to cover the Arab-Israeli conflict and possible peace negotiations, which ultimately, Carter did reach a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. And I want you to deal with these leftover problems like Iran and Iraq, which of course turned out to be huge problems. So Gary Sick became the point man for President Carter on Iran. And he was the point man during the hostage crisis and the hostage rescue mission. Later, Gary Sick came to believe that President Reagan, when he was still Governor Reagan, and George H.W. Bush had been behind the scenes involved in negotiating with Iran to keep the hostages from being released until Reagan would be elected president. It's a hugely controversial matter. Now you see the headlines of the New York Times: Reagan takes oath as 40th president, promises an era of national renewal. Minutes later, the 52 US hostages in Iran fly to freedom after a 444-day ordeal. I think that was Warren Burger, Chief Justice, swearing in Reagan with Nancy Reagan there on January 20th, 1981. So Sick believed, after careful study, that the hostages released on January 20th, 1981, the day of the inauguration of Reagan, because Reagan had promised a better deal with Iran had they waited rather than releasing them earlier under Carter. This later led to a whole congressional investigation about whether this was true or not. Sick played a prominent role arguing that Carter was basically screwed by Reagan in order to forestall the release to help Reagan. But it turned out there never was definitive proof of Sick's allegations. It was never proven that Bush did negotiate behind the scenes to stall the release of the hostages. Okay. Amazing times. This next. So totally separately, there was an Iranian nuclear tract. The Shah had tremendously developed around its infrastructure, its economy. He wanted it to become one of the world's great countries. Iran actually ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, but he also sought Iranian nuclear weapons. When I was in Cambridge in the 70s and 80s, I was a faculty member at the Kennedy School at Harvard and had a lot of contact with MIT colleagues. And my colleagues there used to say that very large numbers of Iranians were studying nuclear engineering at MIT. And in fact, we now know some of the key figures in the Iranian nuclear program were graduates of the MIT program. Later on in the 1990s, Russia supported Iran on nuclear energy, though not nuclear weapons. The map shows a number of the key facilities related to Iran's nuclear capability. And actually, you see one of them in the middle there. To the left of the word Iran is Natanz. And that was just in the news over the weekend because Natanz was just attacked in what was thought to be an Israeli cyber operation to cause Natanz facilities to malfunction. Natanz is a source of weapons grade material coming from Iranian enrichment capabilities. Natanz is very active today, at least it was until the cyber attack over the weekend. Okay. We now know that in the 2000s, Iran developed a clandestine uranium enrichment program. It had a nuclear power plant, including one at Bushehr, which was developed with Russian assistance. It had uranium mines. It had a nuclear weapon research and bomb design program. It was moving slowly but carefully, incrementally toward nuclear weapons acquisition. And remember, Iran has been a vehemently anti-Western, anti-American, and anti-Israeli country since Ayatollah Khomeini took power in 1979 and succeeded by Ali Khamenei in 1989. So the US has not been interested at all in furthering Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. Okay. There are various features to this set of issues. Iran began to use proxy forces to further pro-Iranian, pro-Shia activities in the region. Iran sent some of its forces into Syria to help Assad maintain power, working with the Russians. They support the Hezbollah Shia minority in Lebanon. They support militia forces in Iraq that have gone after and killed American forces in Iraq. And down in the south there, they have sided with the Houthi Shia forces against the Sunni government of Yemen. So Iran is very active in using its proxy forces to further Iranian policies in the region: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Israel has not been silent during this period. They were very familiar with the Iranian program, and they embarked on a series of targeted killings of key Iranian scientists. There were several instances where Iranian scientists would be picked up by limousines and taken to the nuclear facilities. And on the way, a motorcycle would come along and attach a bomb to the outer door of the limousine and blow it up. And several key Iranian nuclear scientists were killed. The so-called targeted killings to reduce the capability of Iran's leadership to move forward with their nuclear weapons program. Later on, a separate activity took place, not a kinetic attack directly. So in 2008, President George W. Bush authorized a collaboration. This is alleged because it's never been confirmed by the US government, but it's alleged. President George W. Bush authorized a collaboration with Israeli forces to launch cyber attacks on Iranian gas centrifuges that Iran had purchased from Siemens in Germany. Siemens is a world-class German manufacturing firm. They manufactured the gas centrifuges that Iran purchased. And these gas centrifuges were central to the uranium enrichment program, separating out the small amounts of U-235 from the U-238 and accumulating larger amounts of weapons-grade material. This was a matter that George W. Bush raised with incoming President Obama in 2009 during the transition meetings. And George W. Bush felt that this was a wise move. It would reduce the progress of Iran toward weapons-grade material acquisition, but it also would reassure Israel that the US was serious about containing Iran, and reassurance is a key element of extended deterrence. Because Bush was very concerned, and then Obama became very concerned, that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister then, the Israeli prime minister now, was willing to attack Iran directly and perhaps precipitate a major war in the Middle East if the US didn't support it. So I hope this is clear. This is a two-pronged attack by the US, collaborating with Israel, both to reduce the acquisition of weapons-grade material from the centrifuges, and also reassuring Israel that the US would be supportive of them to contain the Iranian threat. Maybe there'll be some questions or comments on that in the discussion period. Okay. That attack, called the Olympic Games, using the Stuxnet worm, was the first open use of US offensive cyber operations. Very significant. It ultimately led to the establishment of a similar Iranian cyber capability. And the US was not only involved in those operations, but also in extensive economic sanctions against Iran that were ultimately approved by the UN Security Council. So you see, the US had a multi-pronged attack, multi-pronged effort to try to constrain the Iranian nuclear program. Okay. By the way, if you look at the map to the right of this slide, if you can make it out, Tehran is in the north central part of the country. Below it is Qum, K-U-M, which is one of the holiest cities in Iran. It's a major Shia holy site. Okay, next. Now we get to the stuff of the simulation. After that happened, 2008 to 2010, the cyber attacks, the US decided to try diplomatic track.
Professor Knox,
Yes?
we have a question. Can you describe what open use means in this context? U.S. has never claimed the responsibility for this, but you said open use.
Yes. I mean, there's no doubt that there was a cyber attack against the gas centrifuges. The U.S. never acknowledged that that the U.S. collaborated with Israel to conduct the operation. So depends on your definition of open use, I guess. There's almost nothing in the open literature about U.S. offensive cyber operations. Everything is highly classified. Okay. By the way, I should just add that I was in government at the time, 2009, 2010, and without going into any details, I'd say I was briefed about the status of that program. But, Obama remained very frustrated by the whole Iranian business, and he also was never too keen on the presence of American forces in the Middle East. He wanted to extricate the US from the Middle East and move to Asia. So finally, in the second Obama term, which started in 2012, 2013, when John Kerry replaced Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, Obama agreed to a very complex multilateral international negotiation as a different approach to try to constrain the Iranian nuclear program. And they have some of the key people involved in this photograph. On the very far right, does anybody know who that is?
Moniz.
Yes, Ernest Moniz. He's a professor of nuclear engineering at MIT, and he later became the Secretary of Energy under President Obama. And he was a chief technical advisor to the US negotiations on Iran, on the Iranian nuclear program. And there's Kerry, as we see him, to the left of Moniz. And two people down is the Russian ambassador. I'm sorry, the Russian foreign minister. And you have other Iranians and Europeans and others present there. 2015, Iran agreed to a long-term deal on its nuclear program with the P5+1 group of world powers, the US, Britain, France, China, Russia, and Germany. And this is described to some degree in Michael McFaul's book. And he was arguing that, in fact, Russia was quite important as a supporter of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Notice who it involves. It involves the US. It involves each of the other declared nuclear weapon states, Russia, China, Britain, and France. It includes Iran, of course, and it included Germany, just as a great European power, even though Germany is not a nuclear power. And it includes the European Union. You can just imagine the complexity of the negotiation. And this took 2 years to negotiate. Kerry was extraordinarily dogged in determination of his efforts to get an agreement. And the chief State Department negotiator was Wendy Sherman, who is now she's the Deputy Secretary of State under Blinken in the Biden administration. Okay, so this was the JCPOA. Move on. Now, here are some of the core elements of the JCPOA, which is the beginning the basis for the simulation. Iran pledged to eliminate its stockpile of medium enriched uranium. It cut its stockpile of low enriched uranium by 98%, almost wiped it out. It reduced by 2/3 the number of centrifuges over 13 years. So that would be till 2028. It hasn't done that yet. As part of the agreement, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, was to have access to inspect all nuclear facilities, with 150 inspectors combing the Iranian countryside looking for nefarious activities. Iran was allowed to continue research on enrichment. Now, if Iran complied with all of those features, there would be a cessation of UN and US economic sanctions against Iran, which are very severe. Remember, Iran is largely an oil-producing economy, and the sanctions were very damaging to its economy. Obama supported the continued deterrence of the Iranian nuclear program, and Iran received almost $2 billion in cash to cover the sanctions relief. This took 2 years to hammer out. At the time, maybe it'll be on the next slide, but before we move on, at the time, people in the arms control community were very laudatory of this agreement. They said, look, it's not perfect, but it stops the Iranian program from proceeding for a long time, 8 to 10 years. And you know what they say, the best is the enemy of the good. This is a good agreement, and it's definitely worth supporting. The opposition view was that it didn't in any way constrain other aspects of Iranian behavior, including its missile development program, which is very substantial, or the use of these proxy forces, as I mentioned, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And it was argued that unless Iran could be dissuaded from carrying out these activities, it was still a major threat in the region. Okay, next slide. Well, I should just say, although again, that maybe this is coming on, that during the presidential campaign of 2016, which is 1 year after the agreement was signed, remember the agreement was signed in July 2015, Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, was deeply critical of the agreement. He called it the worst agreement the U.S. had ever signed. By the way, this is not a treaty. It has no legal status. Legal status as a treaty. It's an executive agreement signed by the President of the United States. So that meant this was Obama's ability to avoid a Senate ratification process. Remember, any treaty that's signed by the U.S. has to be approved by 2/3 of the sitting members of the Senate. Treaty ratification. But Obama knew that it wasn't clear that he could get 2/3 of the Senate to support it. Probably couldn't. So instead, he circumvented that with an executive agreement, which is signed by the president and enters into law once the other parties comply with it. In the meantime, Iran continued its activities. It collaborated with Russia on its military bases and positioning in Syria, on its activities in Lebanon, on activities in Iraq, and on activities in Yemen. Iran's political, diplomatic, and military moves supported Assad in Syria and very close to the Golan Heights, which is Israeli occupied territory, and the strengthening of Hezbollah. So this was something that Trump stewed over for a while, and then ultimately he decided to make a clean break with this agreement, which he did in 2018. That's the next slide. Here is Iran supporting the Houthi rebels in the Yemen civil war, great influence over the Iraqi Shia government, support of the Hamas groups in Gaza against Israel. So I think one of the key features here is that Iran was actually escalating its activities in the region during the implementation of the JCPOA, and this strengthened the hand of Trump, who was arguing that the agreement was not worth the paper it was written on.
Professor Nacht, I think we have another question. To what extent is the strength of the agreement reduced by the fact that it's not a Senate ratified treaty, but an executive agreement?
Well, that's a good question. It legally has a little less status, but any executive agreement signed by the president is law under U.S. law. We have scores and scores of executive agreements. Fishery rights with New Zealand, small things and large things. So, from an American legal perspective, it had no major impact. I mean, the fact that it was one and not the other did not have an impact. It was a U.S. commitment to this JCPOA. Okay, I must be near the end of the slides. Am I at the end? Okay, so now Trump. Now Trump, of course, when he came in, you may recall his very first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia. Now some believe he went to Saudi Arabia because of his personal business interests and those of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, both of whom had a lot of ties with the Saudis on real estate development projects. And the Saudis, of course, are the major regional rival of Iran. Look at the size of the two countries there, Iran and Saudi Arabia. They totally dominate the landmass there of that area. Trump, though, decided to pull out of the agreement, which he did in 2018. And also, Trump always had very good relations with Netanyahu, who we knew from the time Netanyahu lived and worked in New York City. Netanyahu was actually an MIT graduate and who actually was originally a car salesman in New Jersey, and later became a UN ambassador of Israel to the United Nations. And Trump met him and became good friends with him. And Saudi Arabia, while a critic of Israel, is a sort of silent supporter of Israel. So Trump was working with the Saudis, the Israelis, and others against Iran. It's a bit of a typo there. Another action that Trump took was the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani. Soleimani was a key figure in orchestrating all of these militia proxy force activities in the region, both the killing of Americans by Shia militia in Iraq, by orchestrating Iranian activities with the Russians in Syria, by working with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and by working with the Houthis in Yemen. And Soleimani was assassinated by the order of President Trump in January 2020. That's a typo, January B3. It's January 2020. The Iranians retaliated against the US after this assassination. There were two bases in Iraq where US had forces in Iraq, at al-Assad and Erbil. And the Iranians attacked those bases with cruise missiles, and about 100 American servicemen were severely injured with major brain injuries. So this was a state of play. The US was out of the JCPOA. Oh, by the way, all of the independent sources, including the IAEA, had certified that Iran complied with every element of the JCPOA from 2015 to 2018. It was not in violation of Iran was not in violation of the JCPOA. So Trump's pulling out was viewed critically by all the other countries, not only the Russians and the Chinese, but the Europeans, the French, the British, the Germans, all said that this constrained the Iranian nuclear program. It didn't solve any other problem, but it constrained the Iranian nuclear program, and this was worth doing. But Trump was insistent on getting out of the agreement. I think it's part of a general approach that every major agreement signed by Obama, whether it was a treaty or an executive agreement, Trump wanted to tear up. That included the Paris Climate Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Pacific Trade, and the JCPOA. Any Mansuk, any more slides? Oh no, So here we have some questions I posed. Did Trump make the correct policy decision to withdraw the US from the JCPOA? How would you evaluate Biden's decision to come back to the JCPOA? Can the US count on Russian cooperation in containing Iranian influence? What plausible measures can the US adopt to improve relations with Iran? So what happened was, since Biden came in, He only came in January, January 20th. He announced his willingness to sit down with the Iranians to try to get the U.S. back into the JCPOA. Now, note, none of the other countries left the JCPOA. Russia, China, U.S., Russia, China, UK, France, Germany, EU, all stated in the agreement. But then the Iranians did try to greatly enrich its, the Iranians enriched its uranium weapons grade material and did several other things that were contrary to what they had agreed to in 2015. So it's a dicey business. It's complex. You could see the arguments on both sides, for and against what Trump did to pull out, and for and against Biden's decision to try to get back in. In the meantime, we have these ongoing difficulties with the Russians, and now we have some new problems with the Russians in Ukraine. So how successful would the US be in getting Russian support to contain Iranian influence when the Russians are collaborating with Iran in Syria? Now, what we saw most recently, just within the last week or two, was the approval of new back channel discussions between U.S. and Iran to try to revive the JCPOA, and that's where your simulation comes in. Okay. So is that the last slide, Mansuk? I think so.
Yes.
Okay. That gives you sort of summary of how we got to where we are and the complex situation of where we are. We have about 15 minutes. So questions, comments, criticisms, omissions, questions related to the simulation, anything like that. The floor is yours.
Just as a comment, Michael, you had mentioned about your hearing that MIT had trained students in nuclear engineering in the 1970s, Iranian students. I was both an undergraduate and a graduate student there up through the mid 70s. And in fact, there were many Iranian students, not simply studying nuclear engineering, but all STEM fields. But what was interesting when I came to the West Coast, actually the first year I was a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, they had an unexpected retirement just before the beginning of the fall semester. And so I was actually pulled out onto campus as a lecturer to teach the graduate nuclear physics course, the NE 201. Berkeley at that time, for a short time, was on the quarter system. So I actually taught at both 2 of the 3 quarters that year. And I had, I think, 2, if not more, Iranian students in my class as well. And Jay Davis, who I showed a photograph of, he was on the cover of Physics Today. He was in the UNSCOM Team 4, which uncovered the Iraqi program. He actually gave talks around the country, university colloquia on nuclear proliferation. And in his talks, he'll actually at each university point out their graduates, to the surprise, I think, of many of their universities and their departments, who in fact have been known to have gone to various countries to work in the indigenous nuclear weapons programs. So in fact, there were many countries that sent students here to the US and had been trained in most of our major research universities. I don't know about the two students that I had. They were very, very fine people, very good students. I don't know. I never followed up to see whether they actually what they did when they went back to Iran.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you, Carl.
I also have a question, Professor Knapp.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Gregory, you go first.
So I was just kind of curious if, based on that happening, where students come to the U.S., get an education in nuclear engineering, for example, and then go back to their country and work on it, do universities ever get pressure from the government to like not accept these students, perhaps, or something like that?
Carl, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Almost by definition, universities are dealing with information in the open literature. We do basic research. And therefore, in principle, one should not have a problem with receiving students from any country. Now, the State Department does have a list of, and I forget the number, it's a single-digit number of what they call terrorist nations, and that's just going to be very difficult for them to get here to study. But we have students at Berkeley. We would have no problem taking in students from any country, including China and other countries, into our nuclear engineering program. That is the one field where it is potentially a little tricky in terms of export control in ITAR. And we do fill out, I was surprised when I was recruited to Berkeley in 2012 to be the chairman of the department. I had never known about this, but as the chair, every January, I was handed a form that I had to go around to all my faculty with to make an inventory of specific codes we have, specific material we had in the 1140 laboratory, and other specific things that we did to fill out the IAEA, what's called the additional protocol. I'd never heard about this, but we are in fact a nuclear center. We don't have a reactor there anymore. But we have to enter in the whole declaration process for the additional, what's called the additional protocol. So nuclear engineering is the one area that gets a little bit dicey, but even so, if we had a well-trained student, let's see. Yeah, we actually have people apply to our department from Iran.
Well, even now?
Even now, yeah. Now, I think a lot of them their applications may not be competitive, or there may be other issues, but I don't think there's an injunction against them coming.
Thank you.
What's interesting is that Steve Beckwith, who's the director of the Space Science Laboratory, practically everything you do in satellite technology, launch capability, anything having to do with technology, having to do with space, is, not only is subject to export control, but, and so how you thread the needle on UC policy on the fact that, we cannot request citizenship information of our students, we cannot accept the research grant, for a research that has citizenship restrictions on it. The fact of the matter is that we have worked over a number of years with the University of California Office of the President to kind of navigate and thread that needle by which we can be compliant with the interests, national interests and the interests of the sponsor, NASA, Air Force, and others, as well as adhering to the UC policies on openness.
As a follow-up, what legal authority does I guess the government have to grant or deny students in this manner? Let's say you want to take on a PhD student from country X that's on list Y that the State Department doesn't like. Do they say, no, Carl, you're not doing that actually, and you just say okay, or how does that work?
Oh, well, they basically, since the State Department controls the visa process, they're just simply not here. So we don't need to be involved in the decision process.
They don't get a visa, they don't get in.
Yeah, that's the. Do you remember, Michael, what is the current list of the 7 countries now? 8 or so?
I don't really remember. I don't. I mean, I could guess and get a few of them correct, but I don't really remember the precise list.
Are you talking about the ITAR list?
No, it's the terrorist country list. There's 7 or 8 countries of particular interest to the federal government. I think there's Yemen is one of them.
Is it the state sponsors of terrorism?
Yes.
I'm on the website. I'll go ahead and link that right now. I guess Mansuk, and he can send it to the class. It says Cuba on January 12th, 2021, DPRK November 20th, 2017, Iran January 19th, 1984, and Syria going back to December 29th, 1979.
Yeah. I think a number of them were probably removed under this administration. It was a larger number under the previous, I think.
I believe we have a couple of questions from students.
Okay, fire away.
I have a question kind of relating back to Stuxnet. So in some of my prior classes, we talk a lot about how the use of cyber actions can very much change the threat landscape and the deterrence landscape, partially due to like the low physical and monetary resources needed, as well as just simply the different physical infrastructure. So, for example, yes, US, Russia, and China have leading capabilities, but so do actors like Israel and the UK, and even according to one report, Estonia. So I'm curious, given the way that cyber actions have been used, as below threshold use of force, acts of kind of subversion or sabotage, does this change how we need to approach agreements like JCPOA, or do we need to really rethink like the process of I guess like who is involved in negotiations and how we think of leading powers in negotiations like JCPOA? And sorry, that was a bit rambly.
No, I understand. I mean, I think that we are in the infancy stage of having to cope with cyber attacks. This is sort of like 1948 for nuclear weapons. We're just first beginning to think through the concepts. For example, there's a whole question currently about whether deterrence and deterrence theory is even relevant to cyber attack. Because if you think of a cyber attack being perpetrated against us, like there was just one against Berkeley, we all are aware of. What are the choices? How do you respond? You respond with your own cyber attack. You respond with a kinetic attack, military attack. You respond with economic sanctions, or you do nothing. These are some of the main choices, and we haven't really figured out what the right circumstances are. Under what circumstances would we proceed with each of those reactions? I think that obviously now there would be this question with JCPOA. Of course, the JCPOA was signed after the Stuxnet attack. So it didn't preclude Iran from going ahead with an agreement, in part because they were hurt so badly from economic sanctions that were then removed under the JCPOA. It was worth it to them to get the economic goodies after the JCPOA was signed and implemented. That's why we think maybe even now they'd be willing to re-enter the JCPOA and comply. It depends, though, what the Biden position is, and the Biden position is not clear. They haven't really laid out exactly. They've talked about actually also now constraints, somewhat similar to Trump, constraints on the proxy force uses by Iran and constraints on ballistic missile development. So it's not clear that Iran would be willing to accept these new constraints. So it's a really thorny, complex set of issues. Great subject for a doctoral dissertation. Sorry, no good answer there.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I have a follow-up question, but I think someone else has a question.
Daniel?
Okay, so I'll try to make this quick, and I hope I'm allowed to finish speaking. Just like a follow-up on Morgan's question, because it's just interesting that because there is no sort of nuclear response, it's interesting that an Israeli cyber attack is brought up in this class about nuclear weapons policy as something that's like happening in the news over the weekend, especially when I feel like the thing that is going to be circulating much more in the news from this weekend was the killing of a Black man in Minneapolis during the Derek Chauvin trial over the weekend, named Dante Wright. So it's just interesting that that is what was brought up. And I've sent that link to the news story to some GSIs now, and it still hasn't been shared to the rest of the class. And the second comment I want to make is I don't know if this was recorded, but I know there were some eyewitnesses and not everyone in the class was here. But Professor Van Bibber made some sexist comments at the beginning of class, and I was wondering if, Carla, you plan to apologize for, during this lecture in the last few minutes or during the next lecture?
I would not consider that sexist, given that I don't think there's anything wrong with dating a person either older or younger than you. And I have myself. So I'm going to have to dig in my heels there, Daniel. I apologize for digging in my heels, but not for the comment. And
it was more
Professor
so
Rennie took it in good.
the objective. It was more so the objectification of the bodies, just the way you spoke about it, not necessarily what was said.
I don't objectify body. I date people, not bodies.
It's just the language you used was objectifying in the way you described their bodies.
Thank you, Suzanne, in the chat.
All right. I have a comment. I have a couple comments on homework and a clarification on the simulation assignment. For the simulation assignment, if you use bullet points, please write in full sentences, just because we have trouble deciphering notes, and the homework is due at 5. Awesome. Super awesome.
All right, thank you for the lecture. See you Wednesday.
Take care.
Thanks,